All right, so this is our demo for one color monochromatic and intensity scales. So I'm showing you right now your black and white monochromatic, starting at the very end with your dark. You want to try to make sure that you add a little bit of white every time you have yourself going up your scale. Every time you're getting lighter, you add a little bit more white every time. So black and white monochromatic scale, we're trying to stay neat. We're trying to have good craftsmanship. You're trying to make sure there's a change in between each value. And you're just making sure that you're having a range of values. So from dark to light, and I always try to start at the end where it's the darkest. It's a little bit easier to get lighter every time. Right here, I'm showing you that it's okay if you want to make a couple dots of paint on the outside of your scale. It's okay to do that because that helps you kind of test out your colors and it helps you test out your values. So this is just me showing you that it's okay if you want to just kind of put a little bit of color out to the side of it. It's not going to affect your craftsmanship grade. It's just going to help you make sure that you're checking your colors and your values. Making sure that you're adding enough color. You may have to go back and kind of go over a color to make sure that you've covered it up enough. So this is just a nice example of one that a student did where they started the darkest black that they could and they slowly added a little bit more light every time. I asked the student and they said those two grays at the end, not the lightest, but like the second and the third one, pointing at them now, she agreed that they could probably change a little bit. It was likely that maybe the second one needed to be a tiny bit lighter. And then maybe the end could have been a little bit lighter. So here I'm starting to show you my scales. We're going to start with the one color monochromatic. Right now I'm putting out my color and my paint on my palette, kind of getting everything situated so that I have room. With this one color monochromatic, and I'm getting some examples out just to kind of show you, you're going to pick one color and then the tints and shades, so white and black. So all the only paints you need for this is one color, white and black. It does not matter what color that you choose. I like to do blue because with our Tempera paints at school, the blue is just kind of thicker. It provides a lot of paint. It's not really thin. And I start with the color in the very middle and I slowly get lighter and add white, and then I slowly get darker and add black. This was an example of some that we did a while back. We used to use scales that were like 10 values, and that was a lot. So they took a lot longer. So hopefully with your small paint chip scales, they'll be a little bit quicker and they're smaller. So letting you kind of see a change. I recommend that you don't use the color yellow for your scales. The reason being is that usually black has a little bit of blue in it, and students tend to find that when they add black to their yellow, it makes it a little bit green. And it kind of, I don't know, it kind of messes you up a little bit on your values there. It's kind of hard to see. So even though in this example you see almost pure white at the end for the very lightest value, we're going to try to make sure that every value that we have has some of that color in it. So even, and here's a red scale, even if you have your lightest value, it should have a little bit of, say, like red, and then your black should have a little bit of red also, if that's the color you end up going with. So here I am just kind of showing you my scale. I made it a little bit smaller just for the sake of time for my demo. So I'm going with blue and I'm starting out with my palette. Make sure that when we're painting in class, we always have our palette paper on our palette so that you don't have to worry about rinsing off your palette. You can just throw that paper away when you're done. So again, I'm just choosing to do one color, white and black. Make sure you're working on the side of the palette. Remember, we talked about making sure that you're not just working in the middle of the paper, that you're really making sure that you're working on the side so that you can save a lot of space with your paper. So since I know that I'm going to be only doing 7 spaces, I don't need a lot of paint. I'm just going to do the one color blue and then a little bit of black, a little bit of white. You really need way less black than you think because y'all remember black takes over. It really kind of just absolutely takes over the color of paint. So I'm just kind of setting up my palette, making sure my lids are on my jars, and then I put them back. I always have a paper towel near me. Love wearing an apron so I can just kind of wipe my hands off on it. And so this kind of lets you see with this scale, it's different from our black and white scale. With our black and white, we started at the very end, that was the darkest, and we worked our way up. With this scale, we're actually going to start in the middle. That's where you're going to put your base color. So I'm going to put my blue in the very middle. And then as I get lighter, I'm going to slowly add a little bit of white. And as I get darker, I'm going to slowly add a little bit of black. Remember, when we add white, that's called making our tints. And when we add black, that's called making our shades. So here I show you, please don't be afraid to add paint. You all are doing wonderfully with not pouring out too much paint on your palette. You're not wasting it, but it's kind of the flip side. Y'all are not putting enough paint on your brush, and it's making it thin and streaky. So I really want you to work on trying to put more paint on your brush. All right, so there I've kind of layered it, and we're not scrubbing the brush onto the paper. Remember, you kind of have to layer it and kind of lay it on softly. I've just moved my scale over where it's not laying in my paint, kind of moving it around so that it works better. This is a very limited space I had under my podium, or on my podium under my light. All right, so moving on, I'm trying to think back to this morning because I'm recording this audio later, kind of showing you how I set up. My black's on the left, my white's on the bottom, and my blue is on the right. Remember how we make our piles? So I've got my blue and I'm making my pile for blue. And then when I add white, I'm just going to get a little bit out from the side and I'm going to mix it, because the only thing getting in that white should be the blue. So if I'm working from the edge and you can see my color starting to change now, then you should be able to keep your white clean if you're only grabbing from the side. So you see that I'm taking my white and I'm adding it a little bit into my blue very incrementally. When I mix up my paint, remember we talked about how it's like sweeping in your house. When you're finished sweeping, you sweep everything into a pile and then you put it in the dustpan. So you're doing the same way when you're mixing your paint. You're kind of sweeping it all into the middle of the pile and then scooping it onto your brush. You're not spreading it out all over the paper because it just wastes it. And you just spent all that time making a color and mixing a color. So there's my lighter value. I'm going to work on the left to slowly get lighter. And over there, I'm just kind of mixing, and I try to hold it up so that you can see me mix. Remember, we always try to mix in the same pile because you're just kind of adding more to the original pile. It helps you kind of make sure that I don't know, it just kind of saves you time, honestly. It helps you. If you've already done the work to start to get lighter in the same pile, just keep going. So I see that it needs to be lighter, add a little bit of white. Remember, if you're adding light to a darker color, you're going to need a little bit more of it. When you add dark, it just takes over. A light color is like a drop in the ocean. So I'm sweeping it all to the middle. And when I sweep it all to the middle, I also kind of squeeze my brush onto the palette and I kind of roll the paint off. That just saves my paint. And right there, I'm showing you again, you can put a dot and kind of smear it, and that shows you more of the true color. That's what that person did on their black and white scale a second ago at the beginning when I showed it to you. So you can see that white really helped. It helped to get a little bit lighter. So I'm going to have to work my way up and get a little bit lighter for my blue. My lightest value, like I said, is not going to be pure white. It's going to end up being a very, 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 very light blue. Like white with a tiny bit of blue in it. Sometimes my camera freezes, as y'all know. All right, so here I am making another pile. I'm adding lots of blue to it. So at this point, I didn't finish my scale at the very end. I didn't finish the lightest one. I just went ahead and started with my darkest. So the camera, y'all know, it's kind of hard to see things when they get a little bit darker. But basically what I did was I took my blue, I started a new pile, and I added a tiny bit of black to it. I like to smear a little bit of that color out so that I can test what the color is. That's why I'm doing that kind of to the side. I did not start my dark in the same pile because y'all know black and white, what do they make? They make gray. So if I had added black and blue to that original pile that had white, I would have started to get a gray, and that's not what a monochromatic scale is. It's white, black, and one color, which is blue. So I'm starting to slowly add black to that pile. I'm mixing it up. When you're working with it, you're going to be able to see that color much better. But when I smear it on the paper a little bit, that's my trick to kind of help me know what the color really looks like. These are all just a part. This is all just a part of kind of learning how to paint. We'll start to get to know it. As I'm doing this, I make sure that I have a brush that's kind of appropriately sized. That very last value that I just pointed at on the very left, that's the lightest one right now, where the light values are, it's not white. I haven't painted in that. Make sure that you're using a brush that's not too teeny tiny. And I'm just telling my class that my very ends are going to have a little bit of blue in them too. But for the sake of time, we had to move on. All right, the next thing that I start is the intensity scale. So here I'm telling you about what kind of colors we use for an intensity scale. So intensity is all about how we neutralize kind of what the color's intensity, basically. So if I want to make a color less vivid, I'm going to add its complement. And the complementary colors are across from each other on the color wheel. So here I'm showing a pair that's purple and yellow. As you start to go into the middle, the colors start to get a little bit murkier and a little bit duller and a little more neutral, which just means less vivid, less bright. So on this one, as I go to the middle, with the purple, I'm slowly adding a little bit more yellow. And with the yellow, I'm slowly adding a little bit more purple. So with every step that I go to the middle, I add a little bit of the opposite. We've talked about why you would want to do this. Y'all know I'm all about why. Why are we doing this? The reason for doing it. If you're wanting to make shadows that are really thoughtful and really beautiful and really realistic, you want to add a color as the shadow instead of black or gray. Black just zaps the life out of color. But you can see as I start to add purple to that yellow, as I'm pointing out right there, it starts to get a little more brown and a little darker. So when colors have temperatures, like yellow is a warm color and purple is a cool color, when you add purple to yellow, it's cooling it off. And when you add yellow to purple, it's warming that purple up. Same with orange and blue, as I'm showing. So when I start to go to the middle with blue, I add more orange. When I start to go to the middle with orange, I add more blue. Same with red and green. Those are complementary colors too. Would be very helpful if you were painting something like leaves and you wanted to make shadows. So you wanted to add red to the shadows instead of black. So this scale you're making with your paint chip scale, just like before. Getting your paper, tracing it out like we did in class. Again, I've made a smaller one. I'm only pouring out a little bit that I need. That's probably definitely going to get used because we do a lot of mixing for our intensity scales. And so I'm doing yellow and violet, yellow and purple. They're the same thing, purple and violet. I'm working on the side of my palette. I did not need to change my paper because I was thoughtful about where I put my colors for my palette. And I put them near each other because you're going to end up mixing them pretty much together anyway. So again, I'm showing you my example. I have a little bit of space on the outside so I can write you a note when I'm grading. It's nice too. It's a nice place to put your finger when you're painting it. All right, so showing you my example of what it's going to look like. So when we do intensity scales, again, we're starting in a different place than before. You're going to put the true pure color on either end. So for my yellow and purple, my yellow is going to go at one end as I'm starting there. I'm going very, very quickly in this scale. I even told my students this morning, I said, I'm a little uncomfortable with how fast I'm going because I know I'm going to be a little bit messy and I'm not going to be able to be as neat as I can be. When you rush things, especially like the intensity scale with painting, it's going to be evident and it's going to be sloppy. So I try to go as slow as I can. I was kind of crunching for time because at this point we had been talking a long time, but everybody had been listening and watching great. All right, so yellow on one end. I'm cleaning my brush. Please make sure that you squeeze out your bristles with a paper towel. You scrub the bottom of your bowl. You clean it. Do not put any wet, soaking wet paintbrushes onto your paper because it'll tear a hole and it'll just waste your paint. It'll get all watery. But I make sure I've got enough paint on my brush. I try to stay in that edge. I remember this at this point I was talking about going too fast. So I tried to slow down. Try to stay clean. All right, so yellow on one end, purple at the other end. I think I just ended up, and we'll see what I do in a second. I think I ended up starting with yellow just because it was lighter and I wanted to go light to dark. So for my yellow on my palette, I'm going to add the tiniest bit of purple to start to cool it off and get it darker. Getting things ready. So I still make my piles because I want to keep my yellow clean and my purple clean as long as I can. So I add a tiny dot of purple, and you're going to see in just a second it was not enough. It does change a little bit. You can see it on my palette. Definitely got a little bit darker. This turned this really beautiful golden yellow. I love purple and yellow mixed together. I didn't quite make enough either. That yellow is very thin if you're using our school paint. Most yellows are very thin for some reason. So I needed to make more and I also needed to make it darker. But you'll see as I put it on the paper that it needed to get a tad bit darker. Looks very different on paper. So at this point I asked, does it need to be darker? It does indeed. Let's add a little bit more violet, and I go ahead and add more yellow too because I did not make enough paint. So already it turns nice and dark. It's a little bit darker this time. That's probably too dark looking back. That's why I added some yellow. If your pile just kind of gets out of control, like you're just not making anything change, it's staying dark, it's not happening, things aren't working, make a new pile. There's nothing stopping you from using more of that paper and starting kind of fresh. Not starting over with a new paper, but start fresh with a new place on your paper. Because sometimes it's so hard to bring that color back when it gets a little bit too dark in that pile. So I think that's a good start. Looking back, could have found a happy medium between making it a little bit lighter and not that dark, but I needed to move on. Sometimes you don't know what your value should look like until the one next to it is finished too. That's also very important with the black and white monochromatic. It's good to keep in mind. So here I've added a lot more purple to make it darker. Remember, as we go to the middle, you're using the opposite, the complement, to try to kind of get it as far away from its original brightness and vividness as possible. When you get to the middle value, that should be like a perfect mix of the two colors, like a 50-50 amount. I'm slowly adding more every time, but by the time I get to that number 4, that middle one, that's a good change in values that I'm making. It should be perfect, perfectly split. So I'm making sure that I add in enough paint as I work. So here I'm finishing up my yellow side and I'm about to move on to my purple. So it's looking pretty good so far. I could probably be using more paint literally on my brush, adding a little bit more. So I'm getting ready to do the purple. I'm going to start with my piles again, grabbing my palette. And just like before, remember when I said I'm going to leave my middle, I'm going to do all the purple first, and then I'm going to go back to my middle. So here I am making my purple pile, adding a little bit of yellow. Remember that light color is a drop in the ocean. That means that it'll just disappear. So we've got to really work to bring it back. I still go ahead and I start in a new pile because you're starting from the purple end, so I start a purple pile. So I add a little bit of yellow into my pile. I'm warming up my purple, just thinking about those color temperatures. So that looks pretty good. Something I'm realizing I could have been doing again was adding more paint to my paintbrush. And when you're getting to work, you'll have a little bit more time than I will in class. I'm kind of up here under the camera. But that's something that you'll work on, is making sure that you've got plenty of paint on your brush. Plenty is already mixed up and mixed together. So you can already go ahead and see my purple has warmed up. There's a little bit more yellow in it. It's getting a little more murky. It's getting a little more brown. And again, intensity scales are one of those scales that just really can kind of confuse you. But the more that you really practice them, the more that you understand them, they become a lot easier to understand. And you can really use anything besides a template, to make your scale. If you even just need to make some marks, do whatever kind of colors you want to for your scale. You can do that in your sketchbook at home for some practice. So my very last one is going to be the middle one, and it depends on what everything else looks like. And I knew I needed to go back and fix that because I asked my students which ones were looking similar, and they definitely told me those two. So yes, I needed to fix those. So I'm working on my last one, which is like a perfect mix of the two. I'm going ahead and just kind of mixing what I have left. That's kind of what I like to do because I don't like to waste it. So I just kind of mix it up. I kind of base it on what's already there and how it needs to be different. So I know that this one needs to be a perfect mix of that purple and yellow, and I smear it out to check the color. And now I'm adding it down. So as I look at that, those two that I'm pointing at, they're looking a little similar, but the one on the right does have a little bit more purple, I think. So I decided to add just a little bit more. You can see that messed me up a little bit. The third one from the right that I just pointed out with my brush, it's a little thin, and it could probably use a little bit more purple for sure. So I'm going to add more to that too. So you have your black and white monochromatic, you have your one color monochromatic, and you have your intensity scales.